The call came in at 6:47 on a Saturday morning, and I remember the exact time because I had been staring at the ceiling for 20 minutes already, watching the numbers change on my phone. I wasn't sleeping anyway. My name is Hazel, and at 31 I was finishing my third year as a paramedic with BC Emergency Health Services out of Vancouver. I had worked enough early mornings that waking up before the alarm felt less like insomnia and more like a reflex. That particular Saturday was supposed to be different. I was supposed to sleep in. I was supposed to get my hair done at 9, meet my maid of honor for brunch at 11, and be at the Vancouver City Hall Rotunda by 2 in the afternoon to marry the man I had spent 4 years building a life with. I had even ironed my dress the night before. It was hanging on the back of the bathroom door, ivory, simple, exactly what I wanted. So when the phone lit up with the dispatch number, I sat up before it finished the first ring. The thing people don't understand about being a paramedic is that you can't really explain it to someone who isn't one. You try sometimes. You say it's shift work, it's unpredictable, it's physically demanding. People nod. But they don't understand that when your partner calls at 6:47 in the morning, saying there's a multi-vehicle pileup on the Trans-Canada near Chilliwack, and they're short 2 units because of a flu outbreak in the overnight crew, you don't actually experience a decision. Your body is already moving. Your hands are already reaching for your uniform. My partner that morning was a man named Dex, 8 years on the job and one of the steadiest people I had ever worked with. He didn't apologize when he called. He just said, "I know what day it is. I wouldn't call if it wasn't bad." I knew it was bad because he had called. I left a note on the kitchen counter. I texted my fiancé, whose name was Julian, 3 times before I walked out the door. I said there was an emergency. I said I would be there as soon as I could. I said I loved him. I also called twice. Both times it went straight to voicemail, which I told myself meant he was in the shower, or that his phone was on silent the way he sometimes left it after a late night. I did not let myself think anything else. The scene on the highway was what we call a mass casualty incident. 4 vehicles, including a transport truck, that had jackknifed across 2 lanes in the early morning fog. 8 patients total. Among them was a 17-year-old girl named, and I only know this because her mother told me afterward, weeping in the parking lot of the hospital, Emma. Emma had been in the back seat of her family's SUV, asleep when the impact happened. She had a fractured pelvis, internal bleeding, and a BP that was dropping faster than we could stabilize it. I don't talk about patients in detail, ever. But I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what I was doing while my wedding was happening without me. I was on my knees on the shoulder of the Trans-Canada, with both hands doing the work they were trained to do, and I was not thinking about my dress or the rotunda or the flowers I had picked out in January. I was thinking about Emma's blood pressure and her airway and whether the air ambulance was going to make it in time. It made it in time. We got her loaded and handed off at 11:53 in the morning. I stood in the parking lot of the Chilliwack General Triage Bay, and I took the first full breath I'd had in 5 hours. My knees were shaking. There was blood on my jacket that I didn't remember getting there. I called Julian again. Voicemail. I texted my maid of honor, my best friend of 12 years, a woman named Petra. I said, "Still out here. Incident on the highway. Tell Julian I'm coming. Tell him I'm so sorry. 2-ish hours max." She read it. I could see the read receipt. She didn't reply. I told myself she was busy, that she was managing things, that Julian was understanding because he had always been understanding, or at least I had believed he was. I drove back to Vancouver in my uniform because there wasn't time to go home and change. I kept thinking about the moment when I had told Julian, early in our relationship, that this was the job. That I couldn't always predict it, that sometimes the highway called and I had to go. He had nodded, the way people do. He had said he understood. He had said he was proud of me. I thought about that the whole drive back. I held on to it. I arrived at Vancouver City Hall at 1:58 in the afternoon, 2 minutes before our scheduled ceremony time. I want to be clear about that. Our ceremony was booked for 2 o'clock. I arrived at 1:58. I had been texting from the car, stuck in traffic on the Granville Bridge, and I knew I was going to make it. I was relieved. I remember feeling genuinely relieved. The rotunda at City Hall is a beautiful room. Marble floors, a high ceiling, light coming in from the dome above. I had been there once before for a friend's ceremony, and I remembered thinking it felt official in a way that a church sometimes doesn't. Real. Permanent. I pushed through the main doors still in my uniform. My hair was still in its work braid. I had a smear of highway dust on my forearm that I hadn't noticed until I was already inside. The first thing I saw was Petra. She was standing near the entrance to the rotunda, and she was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before. A light green one, nice, the kind of dress you wear to a wedding. She looked at me and something crossed her face that I didn't know how to read at the time. Later, I would understand it was guilt. But in the moment, I just thought she looked stressed, and I thought that made sense, because I had been unreachable for most of the morning. "Hazel," she said. I know, I said. "I'm sorry. I texted you. I had no idea it was going to go that long. Hazel." She said my name again, differently. Quieter. Something in my chest went cold. "Where's Julian?" I said. She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the rotunda doors and then back at me, and her expression did something complicated that I still don't have a word for. Not pity, exactly. Something more private than pity. "You should know," she said, slowly, "that he moved the time up." I heard the words, but they didn't arrange themselves into meaning right away. "What?" At 11:30 this morning, he told the officiant he wanted to move the ceremony to noon. He said you weren't answering and he didn't want to wait. I stood there in my uniform in the marble lobby of Vancouver City Hall, and I heard what she was saying and I still didn't understand it. Because it didn't make sense. Why would he move the ceremony without telling me? I had texted him. I had called him. He would have seen my messages. "Petra," I said carefully, "where is Julian right now?" She pressed her lips together. She looked at the rotunda doors again. "He's inside," she said. "Okay," I said, and I moved toward the doors, and she put her hand on my arm. "Hazel." He went through with it. The rotunda was still full of people. Our people, his family on one side, mine on the other, colleagues from both our workplaces, his university friends who had flown in from Toronto. Everyone was still there, and at the front of the room, near the officiant's podium, Julian was standing with a woman I recognized. Her name was Sabine. She had been Julian's coworker for 2 years. I had met her at half a dozen work events. I had liked her. She was sharp and funny and wore interesting earrings, and Julian had mentioned her in passing the way you mention coworkers, casually, incidentally, as background detail. She was wearing white. They were signing a document. The officiant was capping his pen. I don't remember making any sound. I think I may have been completely silent. I remember that my hands felt very far away, which is a strange thing because I had been using them all morning and they had been absolutely reliable, and now they felt like they belonged to someone else. Julian looked up. He saw me, and he didn't look surprised, which told me something I needed to know. He looked like a man who had calculated for this possibility and had already moved past it. His mother, a small, precise woman named Colette, who had always been a little cool toward me but never outright rude, stepped forward from the front row. She had a look on her face that I can only describe as triumphant, which is not an expression I had ever seen on her before. "You're too late," she said, not loudly. She said it the way you'd state a fact, like telling someone the store was closed. I looked at her. I looked at Julian. I looked at Sabine, who was not looking at me at all, who was looking at the marriage certificate in her hands with an expression I couldn't decode. My mother was in the third row on the left side. I found her face without looking for it, the way you always find your mother's face. She had her hand over her mouth. Beside her, my Aunt Rosemary was gripping her arm. I turned around and I walked back out into the lobby. I sat in my car in the parkade on West 12th for I don't know how long. At some point, Petra came out and found me. She sat in the passenger seat without asking if she could, and she didn't say anything, which was exactly right, because there was nothing she could have said that would have helped. Eventually, I asked her how long she had known. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I found out this morning, when he moved the time up. I didn't know before that." I believed her. I still believe her. I think Julian knew she would tell me if she knew to faire in advance, so he made sure she didn't know in advance. "He saw my texts," I said. "I sent 3 texts and 2 calls before 7 in the morning." "I know," Petra said. "He knew I was on a call. He knew what the job is. I know," she said again. I drove home, to the condo I shared with Julian, or had shared, or whatever tense applied now, and I walked through the door, and I stood in the middle of the living room in my uniform, and I looked at the dress still hanging on the back of the bathroom door, and I thought, I need to be somewhere else. I called my mother. She came within 40 minutes with my Aunt Rosemary and 2 paper bags from the Lebanese place on Main Street that I have loved since I was 19 years old. They didn't ask me any questions that night. They just sat with me on the couch while I ate and didn't eat and stared at the wall. At some point, my mother said, very quietly, "We almost said something," when he announced he was moving the time. But we didn't know. We didn't know what you'd want us to do. "You couldn't have done anything," I said. She didn't look sure of that. Neither was I. But it was what I had to say right then to keep myself together, so I said it. The next 3 weeks were the kind of ugly that doesn't photograph well. I moved my things to Petra's spare room in East Van. I went back to work because the alternative was sitting still, and I was not capable of sitting still. I answered questions from coworkers with the short version. It didn't work out. I said it so many times it started to feel true. Julian sent me 2 texts. One said he was sorry for the way things happened. One said he'd be in touch about the condo. Both of them were written in the tone of someone who had already mentally filed the paperwork and was now just managing logistics. I had signed the lease on that condo. We had split the down payment on the furniture. I had been paying 30% more than my share for 8 months while Julian was between bonuses, which I had never questioned because I trusted him and because I was raised not to make money a condition of love. I looked back at that now from Petra's spare room, and I felt the specific humiliation of having been generous with someone who was accounting for it. I didn't know yet how right that feeling was. In the 4th week, I got a call from a woman named Adrienne So. She introduced herself as a family law associate at a firm in downtown Vancouver. She said she was calling on behalf of a client and that I might want to consider retaining independent legal counsel before responding to any communications from my former partner. I said I wasn't aware I needed a lawyer. She said that wasn't uncommon and that she thought there were some things I should know. I went in on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and I sat across from Adrienne Tissot in a 7th floor office with a view of the harbor, and she opened a file and asked me a series of questions that rearranged my understanding of the past 4 years of my life. Did I know that Julian's vehicle was registered under a numbered company that had been dissolved by the CRA in 2022 for failure to file? I did not. Did I know that he was named in a civil claim filed in BC Supreme Court in the spring of 2023 by 2 former business partners alleging breach of fiduciary duty in a failed real estate development in Surrey? I did not. Did I know that a judgment had been entered against him in that case, in the amount of $178,000, which remained unsatisfied? I did not know that either. The reason I'm asking, Adrian said, setting the file flat on the desk, is that we're trying to establish whether you were made aware of his financial situation before you signed any joint documents. Were there any joint bank accounts? Any co-signed loans? I thought about it. I thought carefully. No, I said. He brought it up twice, setting up a joint account. I kept saying we'd do it after the wedding. She nodded, making a note. And the condo lease? My name only. He said putting his name on it would complicate something with a line of credit. I didn't push it. She looked up from her notepad. She held eye contact for a moment longer than felt casual. Miss Brennan, she said, I think you may have, entirely by accident, protected yourself quite thoroughly. I sat with that for a second. Who is your client? I asked. She said she wasn't at liberty to specify. Later, I would piece together that it was one of the Surrey business partners, doing due diligence on assets. Julian might claim in order to satisfy the judgment. They had found his marriage registration. They had found my name on the application. They needed to know what they were dealing with. What they were dealing with was a woman who had never gotten around to merging her finances with a man who had apparently needed her to. I don't know exactly when Julian had decided to marry Sabine instead of me. I don't know if it was a recent decision or a long one. I know that Sabine wore white to a ceremony she had clearly known about in advance, and that Julian had a marriage license ready to go at noon on a Saturday when I was 3 hours east on the Trans-Canada, and that the logistics of obtaining a marriage license in British Columbia require at least some advance planning. I know that he watched my calls go to voicemail that morning. I know he moved the ceremony time up to noon when he knew I was unreachable and couldn't argue. And I know he told the officiant I wasn't coming, because the officiant told the same story to both me and my mother when we asked. Separately, weeks later, I've had a lot of time to think about what that means. Whether he planned it that way, whether he took advantage of the timing when it fell into his lap, or whether the two things were always going to happen, and the highway just gave him a convenient window. I don't have an answer. What I have is the arithmetic. He knew what my job was. He knew Saturday mornings carried risk, and he had a backup plan ready that didn't include me. I try not to spend too much time on the question of whether Sabine knew I was out working an accident that morning. I've thought about it. I've come back to it at 2 a.m. more than once. But I've stopped trying to answer it because I don't have the information, and I don't know that having it would change anything useful. What I know about Sabine is that she and Julian separated 14 months later. I know this because Julian called me once in the spring and left a voicemail that I listened to exactly one time. He said he hoped I was well. He said things hadn't worked out the way he'd expected. He said he'd always cared about me and he hoped I knew that. I deleted the voicemail. I don't say that dramatically. I just mean I pressed delete and I put my phone in my jacket pocket and I went back to what I was doing. I'm telling you this story almost 2 years after it happened, and I want to be honest about what the recovery looked like, because I think there's a version of this story that would tidy it up into something more satisfying than it actually was. The honest version is that I went back to work and I was good at my job, and I was hollow inside for most of that first year. Not broken, not dramatic, just hollow the way a building is hollow when you've taken all the furniture out, still standing, just emptier than before. I moved out of Petra's spare room after 4 months and found my own apartment in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. A 1-bedroom with a kitchen window that looked out over a small courtyard where someone had planted tomatoes. I bought a couch in a color I had always wanted, but never chosen because Julian thought it was too bold. I hung my own things on the walls. I let myself be angry. I think that part is important to say because anger got a bad reputation somewhere along the way, and now everyone wants to rush past it to acceptance. I let myself be angry for several months, and it didn't destroy me. It just burned off the fog. The thing I kept coming back to, when I was being honest with myself, was this. I had been late to my own wedding because I was keeping a 17-year-old girl alive on the side of a highway. And the man I was supposed to marry had watched my calls go to voicemail and had made another decision. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts was everything I needed to know about who he was and who I was and how little sense it made that we had ever planned a life together. I wasn't 3 hours late because I was irresponsible. I wasn't late at all, if we're being precise. I arrived 2 minutes before our scheduled time. Julian moved the ceremony forward without telling me when he knew I was out of reach, and then he stood in front of our family and friends, and he made a different choice. That's the timeline. I've run it enough times to know it by heart. My mother said to me once, in her kitchen over coffee, that she thought he had done me a favor whether he meant to or not. I told her I wasn't ready to see it that way. She said that was fine and refilled my cup and didn't push it. She was right, as it turned out, but I needed to get there on my own time. I'm still a paramedic. I still work out of the same station. Dex is still my partner. We don't talk about that Saturday very often, but when we do, he says the same thing he always says. You were exactly where you needed to be. I believe him now in a way I didn't, at first. Last spring, I got a note from Emma's mother. She had tracked down my station through someone at the hospital, and she wrote me a card. Actual paper, actual handwriting, that said her daughter was starting her first year at UBC in September, that she was studying kinesiology, that she wanted, eventually, to work in emergency medicine. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. I still think about that Saturday sometimes, the way you think about a road you almost turned down. What would have been different if the call hadn't come? Whether I would have seen what I was walking into, whether I would have married Julian and found out slowly, over years, who he actually was, I don't know. I only know what happened, and what happened was this. I was on my knees on a highway shoulder at 7 in the morning, doing the work I was trained to do, and because of that, I was somewhere else when the story changed without me. And it turned out that somewhere else was exactly where I was supposed to be.